Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing great. My name is Reza. I'm from Microsoft. I'm Principal Program Manager for Java on Azure. So basically, today I'll be very happy to talk to you essentially about my day job. So we'll be talking about all of the things that we do as Microsoft for Java developers on the Azure platform. In fact, I'll be talking a little bit more about beyond just Java on Azure necessarily. I'll be talking a little bit about specifically about the Microsoft Builder OpenJDK, as well as some of the tooling offers that we have like VS Code. But basically, I'm going to be focusing more on what we as Microsoft are doing for you as Java developers to be successful on the Azure platform. So first and foremost, I want to tell you that this is not a new endeavor. It's been around for a little while, and I'll talk a bit about that in a moment and tell you just how old it is. But before I do that, I also want to talk to you a little bit about why we're doing this in the first place. And I think it is relatively obvious to folks that are attending this talk at least, but I think it's worthwhile to just mention that briefly anyway. So the reason we are doing this work is basically, as you know, Microsoft is one of the leading cloud platform providers. It's one of the largest public clouds. And the reality is that most people that are using the cloud, and then these tend to be mostly really large enterprises, or at least that's a majority of our customers here for Azure. A lot of these sorts of customers actually have a lot of Java workloads. So primarily these mission critical applications from what we observe is primarily either .NET or Java, but there's other stuff as well, right? So there's Node and PHP and Python and so on. But largely the most mission critical parts of those enterprises tend to be either Java or .NET. And this bears out in the industry as well. So whatever industry data that you may look at, whatever survey you want to look at, whatever analysis you want to look at, those things always come out sort of on top when it comes to enterprise mission critical enterprise applications. It's either Java or .NET. And naturally, so this is the reason why we want to make sure that in addition to .NET, which is sort of Microsoft's mainstay, obviously, that we are also successful with Java developers. So believe it or not, as I mentioned, this is not a new thing, right? Hopefully it's you've heard of all of this before, and this is mostly just a refresh and informing you a little bit more about what Java on Azure is all about. But we've been doing Java on Azure for almost 10 years now, actually a bit more than 10 years. So here's a little bit of a historical reference, if you will. So this is a talk that was delivered in 2016 as part of Devoxx France, believe it or not. And it's developed by Brian Benson. And Brian is still, has the same role. He's still out there talking about, what we're doing for Java developers as Microsoft. So this talk that I'm delivering actually is about that old, right? The original rendition of this talk was delivered by Brian back in so many years ago. Of course, this talk has evolved since then, and our services have evolved since then as well. So I want to take a talk. As I mentioned, this talk is not nearly that in depth. It is going to be relatively at a higher level, right? So we don't have a lot of time, just about a half hour to talk to you about. So going in depth is not a practical thing to be doing in the first place. So we'll be doing a sort of a broader overview. And this slide, if you will, sort of is a mental map of what I'll be talking to you for the most part today. As I mentioned, I'll be talking a few other things like our JDK offering as well as VS Code, but a large majority of the time I'll be talking about Azure and Java. So we know that Java developers are not one size fits all, right? So you're using probably many different types of stacks as Java developers. You may be using just Java SE, you may be using some combination of J2EE, Java EE, Jakarta EE, or microprofile. You could be using the Spring framework, you could be using Spring Boot, and what have you. Similarly, when you're talking about Azure, there are various classes of Azure destination. So you have virtual machines, and then you have containers and various flavors of containers. You have managed services, and you even have serverless or functions as a service. So the idea here is that whatever type of Java developer you are, whatever stack you may be using, and whatever Azure destination you ultimately choose, you ought to be able to empower, right? That your experience should be a good, rich experience as a Java developer, and that is basically what we're talking about here. And I'll talk to you, obviously, for each of these things, how we're actually doing that. I believe that we really try to do absolutely anything, everything that we can. In fact, I know that we do. And I also will say that I believe that of all the public cloud providers, we actually do much more than the others. In fact, I really genuinely have a belief that we are doing more for Java developers on the Azure platform than essentially anybody else in terms of the large public cloud providers. You don't have to take my word for it, right? You can take that with a grain of salt. That is the case that I'm going to try to make for you today and the rest of this talk. So hopefully you will agree with me and you'll see that sort of on your own. So we're going to begin our tour with virtual machines, right? So the reason we're doing that is because this is the most mature rendition of the cloud. It's again not new. We've been doing virtual machines for a long time now. You can do virtual machines on your own desktop. We've been doing that forever a day on-prem. And this is the original rendition of where the public cloud started as well. It all started with the virtual machines. In fact, if you remember back in the day, Microsoft Azure actually was called Windows Azure. That's where it started. So we started with just offering Windows on the public cloud. Of course, we've since renamed, right? It's no longer Windows Azure. It's simply Azure. And that the inflection point there was really that we've been supporting, in addition to Windows, various flavors of Linux for a little while as well. In fact, all of the major versions of Linux are supported at the very foundational virtual machine layer across Azure. The most popular one tends to be Azure Red Hat Open, rather RHEL or Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Primarily, again, if you look at the industry surveys and if you look at the industry landscape, that is the predominant, that is the most popular Linux distribution in the enterprise, and hence it is probably the most popular Linux distribution even on Azure. In fact, I'll go a step more. I'll also share with you that actually we have just as many Linux containers and virtual machines running on Azure as we do Windows, in instances of Windows in some shape or form. So this has been huge for a very long time. And it is also a critical piece in terms of our Java on Azure support, right? And all of our customers that we observe, Java customers on Azure actually tend to be mostly Linux customers as well. Now, on the cloud, do we just stop at providing you more or less what you can do on premise with virtual machines or even on your desktop? And the answer is no, right? So we do a lot more in terms of providing cloud infrastructure on the public cloud on top of virtual machines. But even just in terms of virtual machines, we can do more. And the do more part comes in two primary forms. One is virtual machines base images, and the other is solution templates. And both of these things are available in something called the Azure Marketplace. The Azure Marketplace is basically builds on top of Azure virtual machines. And so what are virtual machine base images? Well, they're very similar to Docker images if you've seen those. So if you want to, for example, you're interested in running JBoss EAP on virtual machines, well, you don't have to install the OS and then install Java and then install your given version of JBoss EAP. You can simply take a canned version of JBoss EAP that is available to you as a virtual machine and save yourself a lot of boilerplate work and go ahead and get started. So we have quite a few as well as I'll talk about what our virtual machine base image portfolio looks like in a moment in the marketplace. So that's one variant. The other variant I mentioned is solution templates. So let's say you want to go a step above, and what you want to do is set up, let's say again, a JBoss EAP, full-fledged JBoss EAP cluster with domain management on virtual machines. Well, do you really have to do all of that by yourself? The answer is no. So that's where solution templates come into play. And again, the same as virtual machine images, it's one step above, right? So it will actually automatically set up for you a cluster. It will automatically set up load balancing for you. It'll set up things like storage and so on. So even while you're using virtual machines, it doesn't have to be sort of the old school way of using virtual machines either. So with that, let me show you a little bit about the Azure Marketplace portfolio from the perspective of Java developers. Now, the Azure Marketplace is huge. There's thousands of different things. So this is a very narrow subset, right? So this is just really taking a look at the primary things that you might be interested in as a Java developer more than it is anything else. So again, we have solutions for OpenJDK. You can spin up OpenJDK on the virtual machine. You can set up either base images or solution templates for Tomcat, JBoss EAP, WebLogic, and WebSphere. In particular, for JBoss EAP, WebLogic, and WebSphere, we actually have very powerful solution templates on top of just simply base images. We have all kinds of base images and solution templates for all kinds of all manners of database, whatever type of database that you can imagine. Same thing for messaging, right? If you want to use ActiveMQ or RabbitMQ on virtual machines, there's simple solutions on how to do that. Even things like DevOps platforms, right? So we have a solution template for Jenkins, for example. We have similar solutions for Splunk and Elastic to be running on VMs. In fact, we even have a managed version of Elastic. Now, it is not a first-party service from Microsoft, but it is third-party service from Elastic. There is a managed version of ELK. So again, a whole plethora of solutions, and again, this is just a subset. So next, let's move into containers. So believe it or not, virtual machines are still incredibly popular on Azure. It is a sizable amount of deployments that are just running on virtual machines. But you don't actually need sort of old school virtual machines always. They tend to be more heavyweight than you actually need, especially in terms of more modern workloads. So you can get away with just containers. So it's not too surprising that containers is probably the fastest growing segment in general on the cloud, and certainly on Azure. And it provides you a whole bunch of other nice characteristics as well, things like portability, flexibility, manageability, and so on. And there's two different vehicles, if you will, that we support containers on Azure. And these two are primarily Azure Kubernetes Service and Azure Container Apps. Now, there's other ways of running containers. We won't get into those. For example, App Service can run containers as well. But let's focus on just these two for the purposes of our broad overview today. So Azure Kubernetes Service is basically one of the most popular distributions of Kubernetes out there. It is a top tier Kubernetes managed service on Azure. So if you are a Kubernetes, if you want to adopt Kubernetes, you're a Kubernetes developer, this is your go-to destination. This makes Kubernetes a first-class part of Azure as a completely built-in and well-integrated managed service built into Azure. Now, there's also the case where you want to use containers, but you have the type of application that you don't actually need all of the things that Kubernetes offers necessarily, right? So maybe you don't need things like orchestration or complex service mesh cases, and you don't need very low level in control over, let's say, storage and networking and the like. And all you really need is you have your containerized application and you want to run a few instances on top of it, and maybe you need some declarative services around those. So that is the use case that Azure Container Apps is supposed to solve, right? So that is our, if you will, our second or the other primary way that we support containers on Azure. Now, there's other things around AKS and Azure Container Apps as well. So, for example, one of the key ones is you need a registry if you were going to do anything with containers. Well, Azure comes with a first-class registry. It's called Azure Container Registry, ACR. And there's other things as well. So, for example, inside of GitHub Actions, we make sure GitHub Actions works extremely well with Azure Kubernetes Service and Azure Container Apps. We make sure that both of these things are well integrated into Azure Monitor, which is our built-in monitoring solution on Azure, and so on. Now, in addition to providing just these foundational services, if you will, just like we provide, just like the case of virtual machines, we actually also provide other things on top of these layers to make it life easier for Java developers. So we do primarily two things. So number one, whatever your chosen type of runtime, let's say you're wanting to run WebLogic, WebSphere, Liberty, or let's say Quarkus on Azure on AKS, well, what we do is we provide nice getting started guides for you on how to do that in a proper way. Above and beyond that, we also provide solution templates for certain cases, right? So for example, we have solution templates for how to run WebSphere Liberty on AKS. We have solution templates on how to run WebLogic properly on AKS. And that makes the job of getting started with in these pathways even easier, just like is the case with for virtual machine solution templates as well. It's the same concept applied. And again, this is available in the Azure Marketplace. You go to the portal, you search for, let's say, WebLogic AKS, and then you can get to the solution template that will make your this deployment pathway as easy as possible for you. So next I want to talk about what's called, it has a sort of an amorphous name. Let's call them multi-cloud platforms and maybe hybrid cloud platforms. So it's a little bit difficult to explain conceptually what this is. It's almost easier to talk about, to give you an example of it. So the prime example of these types of platforms is OpenShift from Red Hat. So what these do is that what OpenShift does in particular is that it is an abstraction layer over Kubernetes. So it is running Kubernetes under the hood, but it is making the job of running containers on the cloud a lot easier by adding a lot of abstractions, either in terms of tooling, both in terms of tooling as well as on the UI, right? In terms of a UI. So OpenShift comes with its own portal, and it feels a lot more, if you will, what I call a DIY cloud platform of your own. So it has a sort of an end-to-end experience that tries to make life as easier as possible as a container developer on the cloud. Now, the other thing that OpenShift does, and Kubernetes arguably does this to some extent as well, I think OpenShift just does this a little bit better, is that it makes the job of using these container orchestration platforms a little bit more decoupled from its ultimate destination. So what that means is you could be running OpenShift on-prem, you could be running OpenShift on Azure, you could be running it on other platforms and so on. And basically, because you're using a uniform API, right? So you can do hybrid cloud deployment. So it doesn't actually, it matters less, right? Where your ultimate deployment target is. Depending on your application, you could be running one application on Azure and another on-prem and yet another on another cloud. But you're using essentially OpenShift as a standardization tier across all of those places. Now, just like we make Kubernetes a first-class citizen on Azure using Azure Kubernetes Service, we do something very similar for OpenShift on Azure as well. So we partnered with Red Hat to actually provide you a managed version of OpenShift. It's called Azure Red Hat OpenShift. It's a joint offering from Red Hat and Microsoft. We actually work together to both develop it and support it. So again, if you're an OpenShift developer, you have a very good experience. You have a very good option in terms of a managed OpenShift offering on Azure. So similar to what we do for virtual machines and AKS, we do the same thing in terms of guides and solution templates for Azure Red Hat OpenShift as well, right? So let's say you are a JBoss EAP developer and you're wanting to deploy to Azure Red Hat OpenShift. Well, guess what? Again, we have nice getting started guides on how to do that properly, as well as we have these solution templates that will do things like set up your ARO cluster, properly configure your ARO cluster to optimize for JBoss EAP and being able to run it reliably, even do a sample deployment for you, or even deploy your own application using source to image. All of those things are basically done with a nice solution template. Same thing for, let's say, WebSphere Liberty. Again, there's a solution template for WebSphere Liberty and Azure Red Hat OpenShift if you want to make that pathway as easy as possible as well. So next thing I want to move onto and actually spend a little bit of time on is managed services. So if you were to tell me what makes Azure special, it would be this, right? So you can run virtual machines on other clouds, you can run Kubernetes on other clouds, you can even run OpenShift on other clouds. But what we have in terms of our managed services portfolio is really quite competitive, especially in terms of the perspective of a Java developer, certainly, right? Is we have quite a few more managed services and more mature and robust set of managed services than arguably any other cloud. So also, I'll give you an example of from a Java developer standpoint, let's say, right? So our primary basically premier offering for PaaS for Java developers is Azure App Service. So Azure App Service supports managed Java SE or JVMs. So you can use, for example, Spring Boot or Quarkus for that. You could spin up managed versions of Tomcat, and you can even spin up managed versions of JBoss EAP. And the whole idea of having a PaaS is that aside from saying, let's say, I want a JBoss EAP cluster, or I want a set of JVMs, or I want a set of Tomcat instances, you don't have to worry about infrastructure anymore. You don't have to worry about upgrading your software anymore. You don't have to worry about scaling, load balancing. All of that is basically done for you at the platform level. Fundamentally, all you're really doing is saying, I want this type of service, and you're just concerned with your application. So you're just going to deploy your application. You're going to deploy your jar, deploy your war file, and deploy your ear file. But that should be your main concern in a managed services world. All of the other things, some of the things I mentioned, even things like monitoring, backup, security, all of that should be taken care of by the managed service. That's the fundamental concept there. So we have quite a large portfolio of managed services on Azure. I'll take basically a Java-centric look at it. So this is a subset of the services that we have, but these are the key ones for Java developers. So talked about app service again, whether it's SE, Tomcat, or JBoss EAP. If you want NoSQL databases, there's Azure Cosmos DB. It's again built in as a first-class service on Azure as a managed service. If you want Redis to be doing caching, well, we have Azure Redis for that. You want to use a database, well, again, there's managed services for every popular database that you can think of, whether it's SQL or Postgres or MySQL, even Oracle. Okay, so we've partnered with Oracle to provide something called Oracle DB at Azure, and that is a managed Oracle DB instance running inside of Azure. So you don't even have to set up your infrastructure even for Oracle DB. Azure Monitor, as I might have mentioned, is basically our built-in managed solution in Azure, right? So this is really sort of your equivalent of ELK stack, if you will. GitHub Actions, that's our canonical answer to all kinds of DevOps, and it's even aside from Microsoft, it's incredibly popular, GitHub and GitHub Actions. But certainly it has very, very good bindings for Azure in particular. If you want to use storage blobs or files, we have answers for that. If you want to manage your secrets configuration in a secure way, you want to manage your certificates, we have Azure Key Vault for that. We have Azure Entra ID as a directory solution. For those of you who aren't caught up with all the naming updates, this is essentially managed Active Directory built into Azure, and it's built into integrated into a lot of services. If you want to use messaging, you have the option of using Service Bus, which by the way supports JMS. You can use Event Hubs, you can use Event Grid, and of course these days you can't get away with not mentioning AI, and we have a very robust set of AI managed services. The most popular one, of course, being Azure OpenAI, right? So these are all of the services that are available to you, and they are especially available to you as Java developers, because what we do is we make sure that each of these services work well for Java developers. Whether at a basic level, we provide a simple Java API to interact with these services. So if you're above and beyond that, if you're a Spring developer, we provide for each of these services Spring Boot starters. If you're a Quarkus developer, we provide Quarkus extensions for each of these services. If you're a Jakarta developer, we make sure that all of the Jakarta standards either work with these services, or we provide additional libraries and guidance to make sure that it works for you. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about serverless or functions as a service. So this is the idea that, okay, I don't really need any kind of infrastructure whatsoever. I just have code, and I just want to deploy the code and have the code run sort of as is. So this is what serverless or functions as a service is about. And the answer that we have for functions as a service on Azure is called Azure Functions. And Azure Functions supports Java, right? It supports Java natively. So you can take bits of Java code and just deploy it into Azure Functions and run it. And yet again, what we do is we ensure that other than providing basic Java support, if you have a particular type of runtime, let's say Quarkus, which is actually tends to be the most popular one in terms of serverless, we have getting started guides on how do you quickly and meaningfully get started with Quarkus on Azure Functions. So finally, I do want to talk a little bit about things outside of Azure to some extent, at least. Ultimately, all of these things do have Azure binding. So, but you don't have to use Azure necessarily to use what I'm going to talk about next, which is the Microsoft build of OpenJDK. You can use the Microsoft build of OpenJDK pretty much anywhere you like. But the important part is that if you are using Azure and you're using the Microsoft build of OpenJDK, you get something very, very valuable. And that valuable part is that you get built-in commercial support. So you do not have to look for commercial support from anywhere as long as you're using the Azure build of OpenJDK and you're using Azure. So very nice sort of characteristic these days. And just so you know, we make the Microsoft build of OpenJDK available through Adoptium, completely in open source through the Eclipse Foundation. So if you talk to .NET developers, like I have for so many years in my career, really the reputation that Microsoft has in terms of being a good steward for Java developers comes from tooling support more than it is anything else. And so we went in formulating our Java on Azure offering, we have brought that same ethos into this space as well. So whatever your tools are, and Java developers use a lot of tools. We're not just going about creating libraries and just using Java C in the JVM. There's a lot of tooling around that. So whether you're using Maven or whether you're using Gradle, whether you're using GitHub Actions, whether you're using Terraform, whatever you're using, we make sure that there's a good solution for you as a Java developer on Azure. So whether that means developing Maven archetypes, Maven plugins for our services, we do that. If it means enhancing GitHub Actions to make sure that it can talk to Java solutions, we do that. Right? So this space is also well covered in terms of, and it's ever evolving. We're always keeping it up to date to make sure that it actually works that way. Now, foundationally, we also support Java in the Azure SDK. Now, why does this matter? So whatever we do actually, in the end, let's say you were we have some extension in VS Code, or we have some Maven plugin. Under the hood, it actually uses the Azure SDK. So it is the sort of lingua franca in terms of talking with Azure services. And that Azure SDK actually supports Java. So that tells you to the depth of which we actually support Java developers on Azure. So even at the lowest level, as SDK level, you can be using the Java language to talk to Azure services. Now, again, IDE, if you will, quote unquote, and I'll use the word IDE a little bit in lightweight fashion because of VS Code, if you will. But we know that Java developers are IDE users. So again, even outside of Azure, we try to make sure that we are taking care of the Java ecosystem or Java developers the best we can. So the way we do that is by providing VS Code. Right? And VS Code for Java actually has, you can almost consider it an IDE. It has things like debugging support, Maven integration, JUnit integration, Spring or Jakarta E support, microfile support, and so on. And of course, Azure support, right? So even if you're an Azure user, and let's say you want to you want to use Azure App Service, well, you can do that very easily inside of VS Code. But let's say you're not doing that and you're using IntelliJ and Eclipse, and even then we make sure that we are providing the adequate support for Azure developers there as well. Now, to put all of this together, I'll briefly breeze through a few examples. Okay, so because I know it's a large space, so let me give you a few examples that are very much inspired by what customers are actually doing on Azure to try to tie all of this together really quickly. So let's say you're a WebLogic user and you want a WebLogic cluster backed by Oracle Coherence, and you want to talk to a managed Oracle database, let's say Oracle database on Azure, which is a managed service, and you want a load balancer, let's say Azure App Gateway, in front of your WebLogic instances on virtual machines. Well, again, you can do all of that using just a solution template, and it will make life easy for you. In addition to that, you can be using Managed Elastic for monitoring and logging. You could be using Maven. You could even be using Jenkins on Azure virtual machines, and you can be using whatever CI/CD tools you like. Let's say you want to use GitHub, or you want to use Eclipse. Well, you can do that on Azure. Another example, let's say you've modernized your WebSphere workloads and you're using WebSphere Liberty, and now you want to use WebSphere Liberty on AKS. Well, and you want, let's say, Azure App Gateway as your front end load balancer in front of Azure Kubernetes Service. Again, we have solution templates that will just do that for you. It will even set up your Azure Container Registry for you that you could be doing deployments to from GitHub Actions, using GitHub as a repo, and for example, using IntelliJ in this case. In addition to that, you can also use whatever other Azure services that you want as well. Once the solution template set up for you, you could be using Entra ID with the OIDC Connect. You could be using Azure Redis as a second level cache for WebSphere Liberty. You could be using Azure PostgreSQL or Cosmos DB. In many cases, we will actually provide you guidance on how to do each of these bits of integrations. Let's say you have Spring microservices and your destination of choice is Azure Container Apps. Well, again, you can very easily do that because Azure Container Apps actually is oriented towards running Spring Boot microservices. How? So in addition to, let's say, containerizing and putting in your Spring Boot application inside of Azure Container Apps, now you want to use Spring Cloud Components, let's say config dashboard or circuit breaker or API gateway or service registry. Well, guess what? Azure Container Apps has a plugin ecosystem that will allow you to very easily spin those up and sort of create managed versions of all of these things. Again, you could be doing deployment through whatever means you want, let's say GitHub Actions, and you could be using a whole host of Azure services once your deployment is done, all the way from just databases, managed databases to, let's say, Azure OpenAI, and you can do all of those things. Now, let's say you are a JBoss developer and you want to deploy your JBoss application and you want to use PaaS, right? So the way you do that is you simply tell App Service, please give me a few instances of JBoss CAP or even a full-scale JBoss CAP cluster. App Service will do that for you. Right away, you can use a first-class CDN like Azure App Gateway in front of that. Azure App Service actually integrates with things like Entra ID out of the gate. It actually integrates with managed databases right out of the gate. In addition to using all of the integrations and all of the other services that are maybe not directly integrated into App Service, but is yet still available on Azure and yet also well supported and in many cases documented for you. Now, I'll end these set of examples with something that may be a little bit intriguing, and that is functions, right? So let's say you have 3 different functions that you want to deploy. You don't actually have to use any kind of CI/CD whatsoever. You could directly use the VS Code extension to directly deploy your functions into Azure Functions. Now, of course, if you want to use CI/CD, you can do that. You can do the same thing through, let's say, GitHub Actions. But let's say you don't do that, and you can do that directly from VS Code. Let's say your functions actually process documents or images, and those documents or images are stored in the managed blob storage facility. Well, what we can do is you can add logic apps as a layer that basically acts as a router, and depending on the different types of images and documents that you have, you trigger different type of functions. And each of these functions in turn use different Azure services as well, whether it's Cosmos DB or whether it's Azure Service Bus or whether it's Twilio to, let's say, send out an SMS message. Well, you can do that. Azure Functions has built-in capabilities of doing all of these things. And on top of that, wherever you are storing the data, let's say on Azure Cosmos DB or Azure Service Bus, well, you can read those things in case of Azure Service Bus, again, maybe through GMS, into your enterprise Java applications that are running, let's say, on App Service, right? And you can have a pretty sophisticated architecture that uses at least functions as a auxiliary, if not a backbone, for your application. So that's all the examples that I'm going to give you. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to try to wrap up as quickly as I can. One of the things I try to do when there's a little bit more time in these talks is give you a demo. I won't be able to do that, but here's the thing. The demo that I was going to show you is actually documented in a GitHub repository in my own personal GitHub repo. You can get to this GitHub repo by simply searching for the title of this talk, right, on the internet, and this particular slide deck is actually available for you on the internet. And on the slide deck, you will see this GitHub URL, and what you can do is it's a small mini tutorial that will give you just a flavor, just a quick flavor of how it is like, what is the experience like for Java developers on the Azure platform. Now, in this case, since I'm a Java EE guy, I used Wildfly in my example, and I also used AKS because that is one of the most popular services that we have out there. But once you get started, and once you get a feel for how it looks like, you could apply the same thing to for any type of application and any type of stack that we talked about. And finally, before I finish out the talk, I want to talk a little bit about what we are doing to give back to the Java community as well. So we are actually part of many different communities in the Java ecosystem already, and we have been for some time. So for example, we are in the Java Community Process, or JCP, helping develop the Java language itself. We are part of the Eclipse Foundation. We do a lot of work in the Eclipse Foundation, including for our IDE work, but also for Microprofile and Jakarta. So we are helping evolve these critical APIs that are important to more or less all Java developers, right? So we are not just offering you sort of, here's your answer on Azure as a Java developer. We are also have an answer to keeping the Java ecosystem itself vibrant. Now, to wrap all of this up, we are very serious about Java. I believe we've done more than any other cloud provider out there. Hopefully, you can see that, and we're not stopping, right? So we're interested in your feedback. We're interested in hearing from you. We're interested in hearing how do we make all of these things even better. What more it is that we can do. But even today, right, there's a plethora of solutions, whether it's VMs, container managed services, or serverless, whatever tools that you are using, whether you're using Maven or GitHub Actions, we have an answer for you as Java developers that want to use the Azure platform. And we're not going to be, we're going to continue to see what more we can do. So I hope this was useful. I want to just leave you with a few resources to wrap all of this up. So I'll leave first and foremost a link to the Azure Build Development JDK. Again, you can get to this slide deck just by searching for the talk of the title. I'll leave a link for Visual Studio Code for Java, right? So you can try that out if you haven't already. There's Java on Azure landing page that is a high-level face for all of our Java on Azure offerings, if you will. And we have also the Java on Azure docs. There's a pretty good index, and it's an ever-evolving set of bits of documentation that will give you sort of the breadth and depth of all of the things that we are doing for you as Java developers. So for today, I thank you for your time. It was definitely a pleasure, and one of the reasons I even do this talk is to connect with you. So if you have questions, concerns, feedback, I'm very easy to reach. I'm on social media everywhere. My email is not too difficult to get a hold of. However you can get a hold of me, please do. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to have a chat with you as Java developers. So with that, thank you and have a good day.